disagreement.
I didn't like his term, mark monitor or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, we're actually live.
Oh, we're live now.
Actually works.
Okay, sorry, Vipin, if you're listening to that. So we're on. Let me press the record. All right. Do an intro, Mike.
I'm on the spot.
This is the New Hampshire Austrian Economics Group.
Coming to you live from Portsmouth Praxium, the Austrian Economics Group, featuring Michael Balchick and Andrew Lee.
Yeah. And Mike Vine and
Kyle Mo. Special guests, Mike Vine and Kyle Mo. There we go.
All right, so the first thing we're going to discuss, this is about the Depression of 1907 is the theme of the evening. And the first thing we'll discuss is the Great Depression according to Milton Friedman by Ivan Pongrasic. And I was going to just put the Friedman chapter from Monetary History of the United States on this discussion, but he believes in IP and it is thus not available. So,
and the book's like $40 on Amazon.
We're only
like even used copies.
We're only reading this because his last name also ends in CIC, right?
Yes.
Pongrasic is also a surf guitarist, like surf rock guitarist.
Interesting.
Interesting. It's the only thing I know about him. My fellow countryman. It's actually really good.
All right.
And Durant.
What was
that was quick.
What was Keynes's explanation for why depressions occur and how to alleviate them? Take it away, Mike. You're the
all right.
expert.
Well, supposed
resident Keynesian.
All right. Yes.
And then
I have to bring my Keynes card.
Yeah.
So say what Pongrasic said, and then what you think the truth is, and why you disagree with his take on Keynes.
Well, if I remember correctly from Mr. Pongrasic's piece, he blames animal spirits for much of the irrational activity that happened. But he seems to be using animal spirits more so in the way that like Schiller and some of the neo-Keynesians are using it, more so than the way Keynes himself was using it. So by animal spirits, well, in general theory, Keynes only uses it 3 times in the whole book, and it's all in one chapter. And for Keynes, it just means action undertaken under conditions of uncertainty where there's no probability available. You can't use probability. So it's basically like Mises's case probability, same thing. So that's all he means, and it means it's action where you have to rely on your expectations on the future, which is pretty much all human action for Mises. So it's actually something most Austrians would probably agree with the original definition
of depression.
Animal spirits.
Oh,
because Pongrasic has
and so
a weird definition.
What did Keynes actually say for why depressions occur? And I did just read this chapter, of general theory. So effective demand drops, and so aggregate demand is kind of another term Keynes has used, and this is C plus I plus G, consumption, investment, and government spending. And so pretty much because of uncertainty, for whatever reason, aggregate demand drops because of, expectations. And then the once aggregate demand drops, if the government does not, spend, or if there's not monetary stimulus, or if the private sector doesn't suddenly start investing again, which Keynes wouldn't think they would because expectations are why aggregate demand's dropping. People, for some reason, think.
Yeah, there's more uncertainty that something might happen. Yeah.
And so according to Keynes, then, unless the government spends, there's going to be a kind of cyclical effect. And the Friedmanite explanation, and which is also, I think, very similar to the Samuelson explanation, is question 2. So what is the difference between Friedman's explanation for why depressions occur and why Friedman wants to alleviate, or how Friedman thinks they can be alleviated?
Like compared to Keynes, or just
in general, what is Friedman's explanation?
Friedman thinks it's a liquidity issue, right?
Let's talk about that. Yeah.
The money supply shrinking is kind of what causes depressions, and Friedman kind of separates banking panics from depressions, which the Austrians don't, and I think the Keynesians don't really either. They kind of think of banking panics and depressions in the same breath, whereas Friedman says banking panics happen and depressions happen, and sometimes they can be related, but not necessarily. According to Friedman, when the money supply shrinks, this is when depressions happen, and banking panics don't necessarily have to be accompanied by the money supply shrinking. And so to alleviate them, you print money. And Samuelson, is kind of, I think, very of a similar mind that whenever the price level falls, the depressions happen. then the money supply and the price level kind of move together, which is kind of an uncontroversial fact. Usually when the money supply shrinks during a depression, the prices also fall. Even in 2007, when we were doing QE and the monetary base was expanding, there was still a lot of bankruptcies. And so for a couple of months, the money, like the M1 shrank and the CPI actually fell because the money supply was shrinking. And if they hadn't done any QE, probably the M1 would have shrunken, drastically, and the CPI would have fallen even more. But the QE kind of offset that natural shrinking of the money supply during depressions, which is like the Friedmanite thing to do, what Milton Friedman thought the Fed should be doing.
Did he call for? So I know Keynes calls for basically like a correction. So when times are good, you're supposed to pull the other way.
Yeah,
so balance it out. And does Friedman not say that?
Well, not really. Friedman has this plucking theory where when times are good, you're in equilibrium, everything's fine, and there's no real overheating.
Shocks.
Yeah, so Keynes has his kind of overheating economy where, the government in downturns, it's supposed to expand. Up to a limit.
Not indefinitely. Also, if it doesn't work, you should stop. That's what Keynes said. The Keynesians that followed completely said, fuck it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to, because no one else wants to.
Yeah.
It's a noble cause, Michael. You're a lone man.
Yeah, I'm in the wilderness.
So, all right, have we answered two?
So Keynes would print to alleviate the depression.
Not as much as Friedman, though. Yeah, he was more fiscal and
spend, and then when times were good,
you pay it back.
Stop, yeah.
And then Friedman would just print to get out and then keep going.
He wanted to pretty much keep this money supply at a 3% annual growth rate. So in depressions, the money supply naturally falls and you have to print a bunch of money to keep that stable 3% growth rate. And then, if the money supply ever started really picking up, he would advocate for cutting the monetary base. But I think he didn't really have that theory of overheating. That's more Keynes, that you cut the monetary base in the good times and you expand it in the bad times. And so Keynes is kind of compatible, I think, with the gold standard in a way that Friedman's not necessarily. And Keynes, towards the end of his life, even said the gold standard was necessary. Whereas Friedman, you have to kind of more aggressively expand the monetary base than with Keynes, because
even though gold expands to 2% a year, but not 3%, which is apparently the
just shot.
Here's the problem, though, is because when the monetary base expands to 2% a year, this is very different from the money supply. The money supply is based off this huge fractional reserve, web of debt. And so whenever there's bankruptcies, it shrinks. So whenever there's a depression, the money supply will shrink by 30%. And so you'd have to then expand the monetary base by 30%, to counteract that. And that is really impossible to do in a gold, standard, because you're going to have what happened to Nixon in 71. The French will want their gold. There's a limit to how much you can get away with. So I think, Keynes says, do fiscal policy and do a little bit of monetary policy up and to get the interest rates down. But once you've hit the zero bound, you can only do fiscal. Whereas Friedman said, who cares about interest rates? Just, print as much money as it takes to keep the money supply at a 3% growth rate. And I think Friedman's really incompatible with the gold standard. It's kind of debatable whether Keynes is compatible. I think he's more compatible than Friedman with the gold standard.
I think the biggest difference too between the two is Friedman believed in some sort of quantity theory of money where money is neutral, and Keynes did not. Keynes was actually non-neutral money guy. Stop saying like the Australians. Look at that.
Yeah, Friedman it's just MV equals PQ, very simple equation, like a physics equation that describes the economy, and Keynes is much more nuanced, like the Austrians would.
Wait, what was that?
Well, and chapter 4 of Keynes is very interesting, where he talks about the limits of math and differential calculus and
You're only encouraging him. You realize?
See the smile on my face right now?
Yeah, we're getting him out there.
See, I guess it's my gift.
So I guess
sometimes you become so Austrian, you go full Keynes.
And I think the Austrians should be a little more sympathetic to Keynes, because we really need to hate on Friedman more. And Pongrasic's doing the wrong thing when he kind of tries to get the Austrians and Friedman in the love fest and kick Keynes to the corner. I think if anything, it's the opposite. The Austrians are closer to Keynes. I don't know. That's my thought on the matter. So what The author claims the need for a lender of last resort in the U.S. banking system was due to a systemic weakness caused unintentionally by state and federal banking regulations. Canada, with a freer banking system, had no such systemic weakness and no need for a lender of last resort. So what regulations in the U.S. is Pongracic talking about? And Friedman, and this was the National Banking Act, and Selgin talks about this too, which was passed after the Civil War and set up kind of like super banks that their notes were pretty much guaranteed by the U.S. federal government in a sense, not really in the sense they are today where the feds were promising to bail them out, but they were given an elevated status by the feds and you weren't allowed to discount them. So you couldn't take a note from a bank that was a little sketchy at 99 cents. You had to take all national banknotes for $1. The pricing mechanism didn't work because, you know, if the bank's at risk, maybe its notes should go for 99 cents. If the prices are fixed at $1, you lose that information. And Selgin talks a lot about that, and I think Friedman did as well. What was different in Canada?
Didn't they also have some crazy regulations about keeping banks like state by state and forcing them to have branch? They still, I think there's still some weird laws about branch banking. And
until the 90s, it was kind of like that. I think they got rid of that recently, but it doesn't matter because there's other shit that replaced it. But yeah, that was up until the 90s. And also, I don't think there was like actual reserve requirements in Canada. So the banks could set it at whatever they wanted to.
To my understanding, Canada has always had much less fractional banking. Like the norm has always been like, you know, almost full reserve throughout its history. And I'm not sure if it's cultural or if it's regulatory. I suspect it's regulatory, but and so it's interesting that Pongracic says Canada's freer because he's kind of using maybe Rothbard's definition where fractional reserve bank is inherently evil. And so if there's no fractional reserve banking, you're kind of freer by definition. Because Canada, I think, does have less fractional banking than the U.S.
So if you're going to have, if you're basically going to have guaranteed socialized losses, then you want to have, it leads to that regulatory mindset, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to have guarantees and then let people do whatever they want, because then you're going to get the extreme of, that's, you know, it's like once you Obamacare, you might as well single payer. Oh my God. But don't single payer. Please.
Well, that might be something to look into for a future thing. There's a whole host of papers on Canada.
Yeah,
the
Canadian banking system through history. Because we always, you know, everyone spends so much time focusing on U.S. banking history, but yeah, I think everyone just ignores Canada. Like, who the fuck cares about Canada?
Little brother.
They have moose.
America's
the moose have banks, right? They deposit their
Antler Bank.
Antlers.
Full reserve.
All right. 4. What did the Fed fail to do in the Great Depression, according to Friedman and Schwartz? Well, the Fed kind of was supposed to be the lender of last resort, and according to Friedman and Schwartz, they didn't do that. Now, of course, like Stockman, I'm reading his book, and he talks about how for the Fed to like guarantee every single bank loan that had gone bad in the Great Depression to be the lender of last resort, they would have had to completely go off the gold standard because they would have had to like quadruple the monetary base and take insane aggressive action that would be completely incompatible with that. And that's something that Pongracic doesn't really mention, that Friedman's policy prescription is incompatible with the gold standard, and Pongracic like praises the gold standard at the beginning of the article. So I don't think he really understands that either.
Lost in translation.
And then what institutions performed this task in the pre-Fed economy? JP Morgan. Clearinghouses.
Personally, yeah. Well, there were clearinghouses that banks subscribed to, right?
Yeah.
Suffolk Bank, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was like pre-antebellum, right?
That was after
Metabanks.
You had them before the Civil War and also after for a little bit, because after the green backing period and before the national banking period, it did go back to like whatever competing.
But before the Civil War, it was much more of a bottom-up institution where the clearinghouses kind of arose in the market. Post-Civil War, there were these national banks and kind of nationally chartered clearinghouses and things like that. I think I don't know. That's my understanding from Selgin. That
I think there was like a decade period after the greenbacks and the national banking thing where it went back to the way it did before.
Interesting.
But then it went back to the national banking thing, and things got screwy.
Entropy.
Yeah.
Well, now you have a parallel in insurance. You have insurers, and then you have reinsurers, who kind of insure
Insurers.
the insurers. Yeah.
Insurance,
So that
insurance.
and that arises generally in the market.
It's an insurance thought.
And so I think there's some truth to Friedman's argument that before the Fed, there are these clearinghouses that kind of rescued banks because they were like insurance companies like fire insurance or something. The Fed socialized that market. And so it's kind of like if the government socializes the supermarkets and then stops providing food, it's like, well, that's a fuck up. You know, they should have owned the supermarket in the first place, but they weren't doing it. They're supposed to. Like, I kind of get that. But at the same time, I think Friedman is too optimistic about how easy it would have been for the Fed to like fix the economy by bailing everyone out. And I think really kind of the Fed failed completely. And the best way out is the Austrian way out, where you let a bunch of people go bankrupt, because otherwise, what would the Fed have done? Like quadrupled the monetary base, gone off the gold standard, and set a precedent that, you know, when this happens in the future, they're just going to quadruple the monetary base.
It'd be interesting to see I don't know if they were right about it, but have economists talk about what they consider, how their theories have been hemmed in by political realities, quote unquote. Because I think a lot of them talk in terms, like in the back of their head, they're like, well, given X, Y, Z, then you should do all, and then the rest, all this craziness follows because they're thinking, well, yeah, but you know, bankruptcies are politically unpalatable, therefore you need to.
My metaphor is federal flood insurance, where flood insurance is a market phenomenon in the private market. The feds kind of come in and crowd out the market. And so everyone has federal government insurance instead of market insurance. And then if there's like a catastrophe, people don't get their money or the money's late, stuff like this, because the feds just don't have enough money, or they'd have to raise rates. And it's just a giant like clusterfuck. And so you could say, oh, the Fed's not paying out enough money, they're supposed to be the insurer. But that's kind of what Friedman's saying for the central bank, but that's missing the whole point that, you know, it's impossible for the Feds to pay out enough money. They've created so much moral hazard that they can't even act as an insurer.
Right.
It's nonsensical, you know.
It's a fatal conceit.
Yeah, like all these millionaires have these beach houses now that are like insured by the federal government if there's a storm. And they all are complaining about global warming, and if they're right, then yeah, I guess it's going to impact their $1 million beach house that they're getting subsidized by the Feds. Sorry, I'm like bashing on Portsmouth, I feel like.
I don't have flood. Okay, we bought a house on a hill.
Thank you. Bashing people on Long Island as well. Yeah. Well, they got it at Sandy.
Okay,
so 5, right?
5.
All right, that's a long quote. Yeah. Friedman says, let me take a drink of water first, unless anyone else wants to read it.
I'll read it. If the pre-1914 banking system, rather than the Federal Reserve System, had been in existence in 1929, the money stock almost certainly would not have undergone a decline comparable to the one that occurred. Had the Federal Reserve System never been established and had a similar series of runs started, there is little doubt that the same measures would have been taken as in 1907, a restriction of payments. That would have been more drastic than what actually occurred in the final months of 1930. However, by preventing the draining of reserves from good banks, the restriction would almost certainly have prevented the subsequent series of bank failures in 1931, 1932, and 1933, just as restriction in 1907 quickly ended bank failures then. The panic over, confidence restored, economic recovery would very likely have begun in early 1931, just as it had in early 1908. Does this mean he's anti-Fed?
So it's very interesting because like Friedman, the Austrian take on Friedman is he says you should have printed more money in the Great Depression. But actually what Friedman's saying here is the Fed should have been more constrictive and printed less money initially and kind of like let the big banks let the little banks fail pretty much. But instead the big banks weren't allowed to restrict their payments. So pretty much, according to Friedman, there was too much monetary stimulus during the panic and the initial crash because the big banks all bailed out the little banks, and this left the big banks vulnerable. And then the Fed didn't do enough monetary stimulus when the big banks went down. So Friedman kind of has a more complex argument than that the Fed should have just bailed everyone out at the start.
Doesn't he have all the answers?
Yeah. but is he anti-Fed? It certainly seems like here that he, doesn't think the Fed helped anything. But I think he kind of like has this idea that if the Fed had just done the right thing, there wouldn't have been a depression, which is not true either, because he ignores, I think, the bubble side of it. His version of the bubble is we're always at equilibrium and there's no bubble, rational expectations and all that Chicago school crap.
This is why, Art Laffer and all the Chicago guys were completely blindsided by the housing bubble. Because it was like, as long as everyone's happy, there's no problem. And then suddenly there's a problem. And I don't know where
the market can't be fooled.
It's like Eugene Fama that there's no such thing as a bubble, too. That guy.
Who said that?
Eugene Fama, another Chicago school guy.
And that's why the Keynesians are almost better than them at this, because they kind of have this overheat theory. So like even like, Greenspan, who I think was kind of more of a Keynesian in the sense of said, there's irrational exuberance, at one point. That's like a bubble theory. Yellen thinks equities might be in a bubble, and she's supposedly a neo-Keynesian rather than a monetarist. The neo-Keynesians and the old school Keynesians both have this idea of an overheating economy, which the Austrians also have, but then the monetarists don't necessarily have. They kind of just have equilibrium.
So if you believe in rational expectations, there's no uncertainty, which means you know everything.
Yeah.
So how can there be a bubble in
exactly
in that world? There's never a bubble, but there's never any real action either. So,
Except the ego bubble.
Is that the Nobel Prize Club?
Yeah, that's right. Except our bubble, in which we are all right.
I like that bubble.
So warm.
I don't want to leave. So that's Pongracic, right?
Yeah, so let's do The Panic of 1907 and Mobilization by Rothbard. Rothbard blames the Eastern banks restricting payments at the onset of the 1907 depression. He says they're horrible for doing this because that's, not paying out. And of course, they didn't really have the money to pay out in the first place, and that's the problem that happened in 1931. It's kind of Freeman was talking about it a little, but so Rothbard says the Eastern banks were horrible for not paying out, but probably that's the only way they survived was by not paying out.
So he would say that they should have paid out until they went bankrupt?
I mean, I don't know if Rothbard had the same understanding that they paid out. I don't exactly know. But I think maybe Rothbard did think they should have gone bankrupt because he was so against fractional reserve banking. He's like, yeah, sure, they're fraudulent. They should deserve a bank run. They don't deserve banking stability. But I think
I don't know. It seems strange for Rothbard to be telling the banks what they should do in that situation.
They're immoral.
Well, I think it's because it's a contract violation in Rothbard's views. If you're restricting payments that supposedly people have deposited at your bank and then you don't give them the money, this is a warehouse contract violation in kind of Rothbard's ethical system. So
because it's already a fractional reserve, it's already immoral to him. So he's already pretty much saying "fuck you." So. And
so Friedman kind of, when he moralizes, he said the Fed should have let the banks suspend payments in 1930. And kind of, I think both of them just shouldn't be moralizing. I think it was a giant, enormous clusterfuck that couldn't have been averted and maybe slightly mollified through monetary means, but really it's the price controls that screwed it in the Great Depression. And then in 1907, it was a giant clusterfuck, but it was more market-based and was kind of over fairly quick compared to the Great Depression, at least.
It gets into where Rothbard is very. That I guess gets into the conflict between free bankers and reservists, because it's when you have a demand deposit, do you have is there any like implicit understanding that the bank may not always be able to literally give you the minute that you want?
No.
In which case, if I were an arbiter, I might say, okay, well, yes, but what this bank. And now they had a liquidity problem. So.
Well, it's all in the fine print, I think, which is what Selgin, examines the fine print of the different banks and goes through the contracts and says these are in the contracts exactly.
If you go on his website, he has like the original 1800s contracts.
It's like those terms of service that we all agree to.
Pretty much.
Sure.
If you're for
sign here.
All right, look at my money. Yeah, just reading this shit.
Whatever.
That escalated quickly.
So.
Economics.
that awkward moment of silence after that.
I take it no one's seen the South Park. Okay. So what is the difference between modern acceptance paper and single name promissory notes? Modern acceptance paper is a general promise that the paper is valuable and that you'll get money. A single name promissory note is kind of a very specific, you'll get money from me, you know, like you drew it on a bank.
So you can transfer one, you can't transfer the other one to someone else. That way.
No, because you could transfer a lot of the single name promissory notes, but they'd have to be redeemed at either the bank you got them for. Ultimately, they'd have to be redeemed at the bank you got them for, although a lot of clearinghouses would purchase them secondarily. And there's this giant national, there's a giant national banking cartel that the feds kind of gave special privileges to, and you could never discount their notes in the event of crises, and they were allowed to operate between state lines unlike the local banks and use economies of scale and stuff. And so I think this is kind of like the main problem pre-1907 is that the Eastern banks had all this power and all this kind of ability to overextend credit, and you might as well have had like a central bank because the Eastern banking cartel was so powerful. You know, you didn't, I guess, formally have one, but like Eastern banking cartel and JP Morgan were kind of like a central bank light.
And in fact, served as one and then pushed for one.
Right? Yeah. They became the central bank eventually, formally.
What does I am become? What's that god?
I am become death, destroyer of worlds.
Destroyer become me.
Yeah. So as you were saying, Mike, they lobbied for it. So how does the establishment of the Fed relate to the Baptist and bootleggers narrative of prohibition, or the whole progressive era in general? Is for each one of these progressive things, alcohol prohibition, central banking, income taxes, they're always the good-hearted progressive latte drinkers. Well, they weren't drinking lattes back then, I suppose. And then you had the people who were actually going to make enormous amounts of money off of it, who were really pulling the strings.
Pretty sure they just drank cups of mud back then.
Yeah, it was fashionable back then. Starbucks,
brown and warm. Yeah. I mean, I know Rothbard talks a lot about the pietists versus the liturgicals,
and so Morgan was the bootlegger, and the good progressive reformers who are like, it's evil that JP Morgan has so much power, we need a central bank. They were the Baptists, even though Morgan was lobbying for the central bank.
Like, yeah, you're right.
I'm too much power.
Probably sponsored the event that these people were talking about.
Well, that's what Rothbard writes about in this section is, all the central bankers, finance the events that, all the academics
all the books,
Yeah. So all the academics who are at these conferences going, all the bankers are evil and need to be regulated. We're getting their meals and hotel rooms paid for by the bankers.
Nice deal.
All right. So Panic of 1907. This is out of the Encyclopedia of American Depressions and Recessions. Thanks to Mike for uploading that.
Yeah. Thanks to my JSTOR account that still works from school. So.
All right.
Oh, yeah, so
you get 40 years in jail for that, man. Aaron,
be like,
So, what does Koenig cite as the, domestic financial cause of the panic? Some guy tried to short his own stocks, rebuy it and corner it.
Because that always works, so well.
And somehow this destroyed the entire financial system. And I think, there's probably some truth to that. This may have been like the pin that pricked the bubble, but kind of find it hard that one guy kind of trying to corner a random copper stock could bring down the whole. I think there was a problem before this guy tried to corner the copper stock.
No, it was him.
It was just all him, yeah.
Yeah. Although what did she say? He did own like 3 or 4 of the big banks in New York or something.
That's true, yeah.
He put all his money in there. It was like, well, fuck you people. So.
Central banking, they have the aims of price stability and full employment. They should also be finding and assassinating the one guy who's going to trigger the next.
At birth, kill him as a baby.
The whole pre-crime division,
Your infant has tested positive for speculation.
Yeah.
All right. So what was the domestic, non-financial causes?
Say like the earthquake and
Francisco,
and like
the insurance. Well, I guess that was the international piece, right?
Yeah, I guess those are connected, right, with the whole gold not coming in from the UK or whatever.
Yeah, so what was it? The UK bank decided to not take US banknotes. That was it, or something like that. Yeah.
And also all the insurance companies like pretty much lost their holdings or something. Right.
Yeah.
Wasn't really paying attention during that part.
1.5% of the gross national product.
So the one guy caused the earthquake too, right?
Yes.
It was. Well, he was a miner, so
There you go.
I got the documents.
Got the
documents. Right there, yes. Right, tinfoil hat. Yep.
So Koenig states that the United States experienced massive economic growth in the decade prior to 1907. With that growth came the consolidation of businesses. Between 1894 and 1904, some 1,800 companies were compressed into 93 massive corporations. U.S. Steel was touted as the first billion-dollar corporation. A more realistic appraisal a decade later of the merged companies found the corporation's assets worth about 50% less. Those on the inside legally earned a 450% profit as a result of the stock swaps.
Nice.
So how is this compatible with the Austrian theory of the trade system? Well, the theory of the bubble is that kind of on a microeconomic level, debt is really artificially cheap. And so in the stock market, a lot of companies do things like take on lots and lots of debt for really long-term hypothetical projects, or even they take on debt to do stock buybacks and like temporarily artificially boost their shares by buying their own stock with low interest debt, which couldn't really work if there were market interest rates. But with artificially low interest rates, you can have this. And then mergers and acquisitions, M&As are usually financed through debt. So artificially low interest rates leads to a kind of rash of M&As before the bubble. And this is usually true in all financial bubbles. Before it pops, you see lots of consolidation, lots of M&As. Like Shanghai last week, or I think this week, the market bottomed out completely, 13% like today, I think. And M&As were going crazy the last 6 months in China. All the companies were like merging into one giant firm. And it's like, yeah, this is completely compatible with like the Austrian theory of the trade cycles. That's what happens in the bubble environment when the interest rates are too low. And of course, when they pop, it turns out that these M&As, like the classic example during the tech bubble was like AOL Time Warner, was valued at like $100 billion and they merged, and turns out AOL's stupid and only 10 old people still send the money.
Oops. Yeah. Way to go, you ruined it, bro.
Well, I think like AOL.
Hey, it was new media combined with old media.
Like AOL Time Warner were, I think, like 10 billion and 30 billion before they merged. They became like 100 billion. And then a year later, Time Warner sold AOL for like 500 million and was worth like 10 billion. It was just complete like disaster.
You get
like
Dr. Tap in here to do that math.
Yeah.
I'm 30 and you're 10. Together we're 100.
Yeah. And theoretically, two firms, yes, can combine with economies of scale and create a product that's more than the sum of their parts. But I don't think that was happening here.
They have anything to do with each other.
Yeah. All right. So, did the U.S. government attempt any stimulus in 1907?
Well, they did deposit, the Treasury did deposit money into the national banks and stuff like that. And also, didn't the UK government send some as well? Did I read that right?
I think the New York City was able to float its bonds in the European market and get money from Europe, which was not really stimulus per se, but kind of like stimulus, taking on new, debt to kind of bulk up the money supply. And the feds were doing this, kind of depositing some money, but like $10 million, $30 million with a money supply that's in the billions is kind of nowhere near QE or anything. This is a very modest action compared to monetary stimulus and depression since then, except for 1920. They did the right thing in 1920.
What about austerity?
I think they increased the reserve ratios. I remember, I might be crazy on that, but I think at some point during the crisis, they increased the reserve ratios, which is like, if they decrease reserve ratios, this means the money supply expands. So it's kind of like the same thing as QE. If they increase it, that's kind of an austerity, the opposite of monetary stimulus. So I think if they did any austerity, that would have been it. But like
major.
in 1920, they did major austerity and like cut the federal budget by half. So what did the conservatives attribute the Depression of 1907 to? Overregulation by, was it Roosevelt was in office, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like the progressive leader, and so the conservatives thought business was being too regulated, and in a sense, the banking regulations probably did contribute to the Depression. So they weren't absolutely crazy.
Sure, it wasn't Heinz all along, the one guy.
Oh yeah,
It wasn't the minor. I'm telling you, man.
And so, what did the progressives attribute the Depression of 1907 to? Lack of regulation. There should have been more. It's really not that different from 100 years later, exactly, in 2007.
You didn't listen to us.
Yeah.
Again.
We've only had 100 years of progressivism. We need more. Did the banks attempt to stabilize the money supply in 1907? Yes, kind of. They started offering certificates that were kind of like IOUs, much looser than even substitute money. And so this was kind of an attempt to do private market QE almost, which is an interesting thing that I think because of the regulatory state today, banks couldn't even try to do on their own if they wanted to. But it's kind of like the market was able to do a little bit of QE, which is interesting there.
The old maybe note.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Someday.
And so Morgan was very against this. He was kind of more on the austerity side against, he wanted to kind of let a lot of more banks fail. And he was also kind of, supposedly according to the popular narrative, begrudgingly took this role of savior of the economy. And then there's the conspiracy theory that he kind of, knew exactly when the economy was going to bottom out and made a lot of money off of it. So I don't know where the truth is. Maybe it's somewhere in between the two.
I like the story from this paper where he locked everybody in the room to agree to a deal. It's like, of course you would.
He had a mustache. Everyone with a mustache is evil. It's true. Or a porn star.
Can't be both. Mutually exclusive.
Were bank holidays declared at the federal level like they were in the 1930s? Nope.
States did, right?
Yeah, a few states declared bank holidays.
It was all like southern states too, like the country bank states.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
Georgia and stuff like
It's
that.
very similar, I think, to the Depression of 2007 in that the big banks were able to kind of hang on, and then the little banks in the countryside failed. And because the big banks had all these big artificial privileges and the Treasury was depositing money into them. And, in 2007, the big banks were like just getting trillions for electronic money, much more flagrant than in 1907, but kind of the same general concept that the small banks failed and the big ones succeeded. And it's not necessarily market evolutionary selection because they're so privileged by regulations and they could use economies of scale, whereas the little banks, the Fed said, if you want to operate across state lines as a bank, you need to have a national banking certificate and be part of this cartel.
This is a total aside, but we should start using privilege in that sense.
Yeah.
Like, hey, you need to check your regulatory privilege.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that.
There you go. Jot that down.
You got government privilege. All right. That's it.
Cool. Wow, that was like the fastest we ever went through these questions. I don't believe
I
it.
think that'll make for a good podcast, too.
Yeah. I think that's good to kind of keep it at around an hour or so, not keep people too bored.
Shall I?
Yeah, it's just we're over. So.
All right.
Under 40 minutes, not bad.
Do we have an outro set? No.
Da 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 da.
Ba, ba.
Okay, bye.
So,
Wonderful.
That was
so what are we doing for our next? He believes in IP and it is thus not available. So
And the book's like $40 on Amazon.
We're only
Like even used copies.
We're only reading this because his last name also ends in CIC, right?
yes.
Paul Gretchich is also a surf guitarist, like surf rock guitarist. So,
Interesting.
interesting. It's the only thing I know about him. My fellow countryman. It's actually really good.
All right.
And Durant.
What was
That was quick.
What was Keynes's explanation for why depressions occur and how to alleviate them? Take it away, Mike. You're the
All right.
expert.
Wow. Supposed.
Resident Keynesian.
All right. Yes.
And then
I have to bring my Keynes card.
Yeah.
So say what Pongrasic said, and then what you think the truth is, and why you disagree with his take on Keynes.
Well, if I remember correctly from Mr. Pongracic's piece, he blames animal spirits for much of the irrational activity that happened. But
Disagreement.
I didn't like his term, mark mater or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, we're actually live.
Oh, we're live
It
now.
actually works.
Okay, sorry, Vipin, if you're listening to that. So we're on.
We'll cut off that
Let me
one.
press the record. All right. Do an intro, Mike.
I'm on the spot.
This is the New Hampshire Austrian Economics Group.
Coming to you live from Portsmouth Praxium, the Austrian Economics Group, featuring Michael Balchik and Andrew Kiefer.
Yeah. And Mike Vine and
Kyle Miller. Special guests, Mike Vine and Kyle Miller. There we go.
all right. So the first thing we're going to discuss, this is about the Depression of 1907 is the theme of the evening. And the first thing we'll discuss is the Great Depression according to Milton Friedman by Ivan Pongrasic. And I was going to just put the Friedman chapter from Monetary History of the United States on this discussion, but aggregate demand is kind of another term Keynes has used, and this is C plus I plus G, consumption, investment, and government spending. And so pretty much because of uncertainty, for whatever reason, aggregate demand drops because of, expectations. And then the once aggregate demand drops, if the government does not, spend, or if there's not monetary stimulus, or if the private sector doesn't suddenly start investing again, which Keynes wouldn't think they would because expectations are why aggregate demand's dropping. People, for some reason, think.
Yeah, there's more uncertainty
Yeah.
that something might happen. Yeah.
And so according to Keynes, then, unless the government spends, there's going to be a kind of cyclical effect. And the Friedmanite explanation, and which is also, I think, very similar to the Samuelson explanation, is question 2. So what is the difference between Friedman's explanation for why depressions occur and why Friedman wants to alleviate, or how Friedman thinks they can be alleviated?
Like compared to Keynes or just in
Well, just in general, what is Friedman's explanation?
Friedman thinks it's a liquidity issue, right?
Yeah,
Let's
and
talk about that. Yeah.
the money supply shrinking is kind of what causes depressions, and Friedman kind of separates banking panics from depressions, which the Austrians don't, and I think the Keynesians don't really either. They kind of think of banking panics and depressions in the same breath, whereas Friedman says banking panics happen and depressions happen, and sometimes they can be related, but not necessarily. According to Friedman, when the money supply shrinks, this is when depressions happen, and banking panics don't necessarily have to be accompanied by the money supply shrinking.
He seems to be using animal spirits more so in the way that Schiller and some of the neo-Keynesians are using it, more so than the way Keynes himself was using it. So by animal spirits, well, in general theory, Keynes only uses it 3 times in the whole book, and it's all in one chapter. And for Keynes, it just means action undertaken under conditions of uncertainty where there's no probability available. You can't use probability. So it's basically like Mises's case probability, same thing. So that's all he means, and it means it's action where you have to rely on your expectations on the future, which is pretty much all human action for Mises. So it's actually something most Austrians would probably agree with, the original
That's the
definition.
definition of depression?
Animal spirits.
Oh.
Because Pongracic has
And
a
so
weird definition.
What did Keynes actually say for why depressions occur? And I did just read this chapter, of general theory. So effective demand drops, and so